You are there. The air is heavy, unnaturally still, as though the very sky itself is holding its breath. The damp chill of May clings to your skin, and the cobblestones beneath your feet seem to remember centuries of blood. Around you, the crowd sways in uneasy silence, courtiers in fine silks rubbing shoulders with commoners in rough wool, all bound together by morbid anticipation. There is no laughter, no marketplace chatter, only the muffled cough of a child, the rustle of skirts, and the occasional creak of leather boots shifting on the stones. This is not merely an execution. It is a performance, and you are part of its audience. Ahead, Tower Green stretches out like a stage framed by the cold gray walls of the fortress. You can almost taste the iron tang of sharpened steel on your tongue. The scaffold itself rises a few feet above the ground, simple, unadorned, its timbers darkened by countless stains that have seeped deep into the grain. Atop it, a block lies waiting, though today there will be no axe, no crude English blade that would hack clumsily at a neck. Today, by order of the king, a foreign swordsman has been summoned. The best in France, they whisper. A man whose skill is so precise that death will be swift, silent, almost merciful. Almost. Your eyes shift to the woman who approaches, her figure slight yet composed. Anne Boleyn, once the most envied woman in Christendom, now stripped of her crown, her jewels, her place at the king's side. She wears a gown of plain gray damask, its simplicity a cruel parody of the silks she once flaunted. Over her shoulders lies a mantle of red, the color of martyrdom, though whether the choice was hers or her executioner's remains uncertain. A small headdress frames her pale face, concealing her once luxurious hair. She walks carefully, each step measured, as if she understands that the ground beneath her feet has transformed into the threshold of eternity. You notice her lips moving. She is whispering prayers, perhaps to the Virgin, perhaps to Christ, perhaps to no one at all but herself. Her voice does not carry, yet the silence of the crowd amplifies every syllable in your imagination. She does not cry, does not stumble, does not resist. In this moment, she embodies a paradox that chills you more than her fate. She is both fragile victim and unwavering queen, walking toward death with a dignity her enemies could not strip from her. And yet, that is precisely why they gathered, because dignity is the last thing power must destroy. All around, faces lean forward, hungry for the spectacle. Some are grim, their features set in masks of solemnity, as if they wish to believe they are witnessing justice. Others cannot hide their curiosity, their fascination with the fall of a woman who once eclipsed them all. You catch snatches of whispers, rumors of witchcraft, of seduction, of monstrous births. You hear the hiss of a woman muttering that Anne had bewitched the king, while a man beside her insists she deserved this end for daring to rise above her station. It is not truth they want. It is confirmation that the order of the world is preserved, that no woman, however clever or beautiful, can defy the crown and survive. The scaffold looms larger now. The executioner waits quietly, his French blade hidden behind his back so that Anne will not see it, so that her last moments will not be filled with the image of the steel about to claim her. He looks almost disinterested, a man performing a trade he has honed to perfection. But you cannot help but sense something darker, that even in his practiced composure, he too is part of the spectacle, his skill another ornament in this theater of cruelty. Anne ascends the steps. For a moment, her gaze lifts toward the tower itself, as though she searches for a final glimpse of her daughter Elizabeth, though the child is nowhere near. Perhaps it is only instinct, motherhood clinging to her even as life abandons her. She turns then to the crowd, her small hands clasped before her, and she begins to speak. Her voice is calm, trembling only at the edges. She praises Henry, calling him a merciful and noble prince. She insists she dies not from injustice, but from God's will. Each word feels like a dagger she drives into herself, a ritual of humiliation crafted not by her, but by those who forced this script upon her. To curse the king would be treason. To defend herself would be vanity. And so she surrenders her truth, her identity, her legacy, sacrificing them upon the altar of obedience, because even in death she is not free. The crowd listens, silent, unsettled. Some weep, others nod with approval, but you feel something else, unease, because in her composure there is defiance, In her calmness, there is a dignity that refuses to die. She has become both victim and martyr, and that is the one thing Henry could not have anticipated. The prayers fade. Anne kneels upon the scaffold, her body small and breakable against the vast emptiness of the Tower walls. She does not use the block as an axe victim would. Instead, she kneels upright, blindfolded, waiting for the sword. Her last words fall softly, almost swallowed by the wind. To Jesus Christ I commend my soul. Lord, receive my spirit. And you realize something chilling. You are not just witnessing the end of a queen. You are witnessing a performance meticulously staged to erase her humanity, to transform her into a cautionary tale, a whisper of fear that would echo through every courtier, every noblewoman, every child who might dream of power. Her blood is the ink with which Henry writes his authority, and you are forced to watch, to breathe it, to remember it. The executioner shifts, the sword glinting faintly in the morning light, and in that heartbeat before the blade falls, you feel it. The weight of a truth far darker than death itself. This is not justice. This is not mercy. This is annihilation, ritualized and sanctified by power. Before the scaffold, before the Tower walls closed around her, Anne Boleyn was not simply a queen, she was the disruption that shattered the foundations of an empire. To understand her execution, you must step back into the world she entered, a court obsessed with power, with lineage, with the fragile illusions of divine authority. England in the 1520s was a kingdom balanced on a knife's edge, its king desperate for an heir, its nobility fractured by ambition, and its faith tethered uneasily to Rome. When Anne first emerged, she was not destined to be a queen. She was a courtier, a lady-in-waiting who had grown up in the courts of Burgundy and France, absorbing their elegance, their wit, their dangerous sophistication. She was different from the pliant English ladies Henry had grown used to. Her intelligence was sharp, her laughter edged with irony, her manner bold enough to unsettle yet alluring enough to captivate. She carried herself not as a servant to the game of kings, but as someone who could rewrite its rules. Henry VIII noticed. Of course he noticed. He was a king who had grown accustomed to possession, lands, armies, women. But Anne denied him what he demanded. She refused to become his mistress, refusing to be discarded like so many others once his appetite waned. In that refusal lay the seed of her power. Desire, when denied, turns to obsession. And Henry's obsession would bend kingdoms, rupture Christendom, and ultimately destroy the very woman who ignited it. At first, her rise seemed triumphant. She became the king's confidant, his muse, the woman who could soothe his anxieties with her sharp humor and ignite his vision of himself as a monarch destined for greatness. To the outside world, she seemed untouchable. She wore French fashions, gathered poets and reformers around her, and whispered of scripture in English rather than Latin. She became a symbol of change, embodying both the glamour of the Renaissance and the dangerous currents of religious reform that were sweeping across Europe. But the Tudor court was never a place of stability. It was a nest of serpents, where every smile concealed a calculation, and every banquet was a battlefield. Behind Anne's rise was the destruction of another queen, Catherine of Aragon, Henry's wife of 2 decades, who had failed to give him a living son. Catherine was beloved, pious, dignified, the aunt of the most powerful man in Europe, Emperor Charles V. To cast her aside was not merely a domestic choice, it was a political earthquake. Henry's desperation for a son and his obsession with Anne collided with Rome's immovable authority. The Pope refused an annulment. Henry, enraged, severed England from Rome itself, declaring himself the head of the Church of England. It was a revolution disguised as romance, a seismic shift that would leave thousands dead in its wake. And at the center of it all stood Anne Boleyn, praised by some as a reformist heroine, damned by others as a whore who bewitched a king. For a time, Anne wielded power unlike any woman before her in England. She spoke openly of her views, advanced her allies, and challenged bishops and nobles alike. She was crowned queen in 1533, heavily pregnant, the streets filled with processions as Henry's dream seemed finally within reach. But when the child was born, it was not the son he longed for. It was a daughter, Elizabeth. The disappointment was crushing. Anne tried again and again. Miscarriages followed, each one a visible crack in the foundation of her position. Whispers spread in the corridors of power. Was God punishing England? Was Anne cursed? Some claimed she carried deformities in her womb, monstrous signs of witchcraft. Whether true or false, such rumors did not need proof. In the Tudor court, whispers were as deadly as swords. Yet Anne was no passive victim. She fought, sometimes too openly. She argued with Henry, criticized his policies, mocked his advisers. Her intelligence and sharp tongue, once irresistible, became intolerable to a king grown weary of her defiance. Power in Tudor England demanded a queen who was silent, submissive, fertile. Anne was none of these things, and waiting in the shadows were those who saw her fall as opportunity. Chief among them was Thomas Cromwell, Henry's ruthless minister. Cromwell had once allied with Anne, both advocating reform and the seizure of monastic wealth. But when their interests diverged, when Anne opposed his economic strategies, when she threatened his own hold on power, he turned against her. He understood the truth of the Tudor world. Survival depended not on loyalty, but on knowing when to destroy. By 1536, the storm had gathered. Catherine of Aragon was dead, removing the last barrier to Henry remarrying without papal interference. Henry's eyes had already strayed to Jane Seymour, a quiet, compliant lady-in-waiting, the opposite of Anne in every way, and Cromwell, sensing the king's weariness, moved to sever Anne from the throne. But in Tudor England, divorce was not enough. To unmake a queen, you could not simply set her aside. You had to annihilate her. You had to destroy not only her body but her reputation, her legacy, her very memory. Anne Boleyn could not be allowed to live because her existence would remain a challenge, a reminder of Henry's humiliation. The only solution was the scaffold, and so the machinery began to turn. Cromwell whispered accusations into the king's ear: adultery, treason, incest with her own brother. Charges designed not for truth but for obliteration. Because in the logic of tyranny, the more grotesque the accusation, the easier it was to erase sympathy. A queen who argued was inconvenient. But a queen who betrayed her king's bed, who conspired with her own blood, who sought to topple the very throne, such a creature did not deserve pity. She deserved death. This was the world Anne inhabited in her final months, a world where allies melted into enemies, where courtiers who once bowed before her now rehearsed their testimonies against her, where even her miscarried child became evidence of sin. Each miscarriage, each moment of defiance, each whisper became a nail hammered into the coffin of her destiny. And yet, even as the trap closed, Anne continued to speak, to pray, to resist in small ways. It was that resistance, that unbroken flame of dignity, that made her enemies hate her all the more. For a woman who bows can be forgotten, but a woman who stands, even in chains, becomes immortal. You see now how the scaffold was not built in a day. It was built across years of envy, obsession, betrayal, and fear. Anne Boleyn had become more than a wife who failed to give a son. She was a symbol of defiance, of reform, of ambition. And symbols are dangerous. Symbols must be crushed. From this foundation of paranoia and ambition, the stage was set for the catalyst event, the sudden storm that would transform whispers into formal charges and trials into death sentences. The storm broke with neither warning nor mercy. One moment Anne was queen, seated in her apartments, conversing with her ladies, holding her head high against the whispers that always haunted the corridors of power. The next, she was seized, confronted with charges so grotesque, so unthinkable, that even her enemies later admitted they were crafted not for justice but for annihilation. It was May of 1536, and the king's will had shifted. What had once been desire was now disgust. What had once been devotion was now betrayal. And in the Tudor court, when a king's heart turned, the world followed. It began with the musicians. Mark Smeaton, a court entertainer of low birth, was taken into custody. He had played his lute in Anne's chambers, had laughed in her presence, had been near enough for rumors to coil themselves around his proximity. Under pressure, perhaps under torture, though records remain deliberately vague, he confessed to adultery with the queen. The very idea was absurd, a grotesque mismatch of status and possibility, yet once spoken, it became truth. Because, in a court driven by fear, confession mattered more than reality. Smeaton's words, forced from his mouth, were inked into history as evidence, binding him to her fate. But Cromwell was not content with one scapegoat. He cast his net wider. Sir Henry Norris, groom of the stool, was accused. Then Sir Francis Weston, then William Brereton, men of the King's Chamber, men trusted, men close, and finally George Boleyn, Anne's own brother, Lord Rochford. Incest, treason, adultery multiplied into conspiracy, until Anne's supposed crimes became so monstrous that the image of her as a queen, as a reformer, as a mother, was obliterated. What remained was a caricature, a scheming, lustful, unnatural woman whose ambition had twisted her into a threat against king and kingdom alike. The trials were a theater of humiliation. Anne was brought before her peers in the great hall of the Tower, men who had once smiled at her table, now arrayed to condemn her. The accusations read aloud sounded less like legal charges and more like dark fantasies scrawled in the margins of history. They claimed she had seduced courtiers, corrupted noble bloodlines, even plotted the death of the king himself. They claimed her own brother had shared her bed, a story so grotesque it defied nature, yet in its obscenity lay its power. The greater the lie, the more it overwhelmed reason. Anne stood before them, tall, composed, refusing to cower. She denied each charge, her words firm, her gaze unflinching. But denial meant nothing. The verdict had already been written, whispered not in the hall but in the private chambers of Henry and Cromwell. The lords of the jury, bound by fear and ambition, declared her guilty. In that moment, the Queen was not merely condemned, she was erased. And yet, the cruelty of the process was not only in the verdict, it was in the betrayal that accompanied it. Anne had been surrounded by courtiers, by allies who once celebrated her rise, who once benefited from her favor. Where were they now? Silent, absent, or worse, complicit. Even her uncle, the Duke of Norfolk, presided over her trial with cold detachment, sentencing his own niece to death. The very family that had lifted her to power abandoned her in the moment of collapse. In Tudor England, loyalty ended where survival began. From the moment the charges were laid, Anne's fate was sealed. But what makes this descent so grotesque is not only the swiftness of her fall, but the intimacy of the accusations. These were not abstract crimes. They were private, personal, sexual. Her body, her relationships, her very intimacy was twisted into a weapon. The court, the public, the realm itself were invited to peer into her bed, to imagine her sins, to consume the humiliation of a queen turned harlot. It was not enough to kill her. She had to be shamed, stripped, defiled in reputation so thoroughly that even sympathy would be impossible. Imagine the nights in the Tower. Anne, confined in her apartments, knowing the trial had already condemned her, hearing the echoes of footsteps, the clink of keys, the whispers of her gaolers. She prayed, she wept, she laughed nervously, at times insisting Henry could not do this, at other times accepting that God had willed her end. She shifted between hope and despair, knowing each hour drew her closer to the scaffold. And outside, Cromwell sharpened his narrative, ensuring that when she died, it would not be as a queen unjustly wronged, but as a monster justly punished. The psychological brutality was relentless. Every man accused with her was executed before her eyes could see freedom again, each one paraded through the streets, their heads spiked as warning. Even her brother George, dragged down in the same web of lies, met his death with words on his lips that history could never erase. For Anne, the agony was not only her own impending death, but the knowledge that her downfall had destroyed those around her. Her name had become poison, and anyone who drank of it died. This was the catalyst event, the trap closing, the accusations transforming rumor into reality, the machinery of Tudor justice grinding inexorably toward execution. But beneath the surface, beneath the formal charges and confessions, lay the darker truth, that Anne's real crime was not adultery, nor treason, nor incest. Her crime was ambition. Her crime was influence. Her crime was being a woman who had dared to wield power in a world that demanded her silence. By the time her trial ended, Anne was no longer queen, no longer wife, no longer mother. She was an object, a spectacle, her body waiting to be transformed into an instrument of warning. The web of lies had done its work. And now only one act remained in this brutal performance, the long, slow descent toward the scaffold. The tower does not sleep. Even at night, when the city beyond its walls sinks into uneasy silence, the fortress hums with a low and steady pulse, the rhythm of keys turning, boots scraping against stone, the muffled voices of guards repeating their watch. Within its walls, Anne Boleyn counted the final days of her life. Daylight seeped into her chamber only through narrow slits, pale beams that fell across the floor like bars of judgment. She prayed beneath them, whispered confessions, clutched at fragments of scripture, though whether she sought absolution from God or comfort from herself, even she could not say. The apartments in which she was held had once housed queens in triumph, but for Anne they were transformed into antechambers of death. Her meals were delivered in silence, her ladies-in-waiting chosen by her enemies, instructed not to comfort her but to observe, to record, to twist every word she spoke into evidence against her. When she laughed nervously, they whispered that she had gone mad. When she prayed with composure, they murmured that she welcomed death with unnatural calm. No gesture could be innocent. No word could escape interpretation. She lived in a theater, even in solitude, every breath scrutinized, every movement marked down for posterity. The cruelty was deliberate, for in Tudor England execution was not an event but a process, a ritual designed to strip away every shred of dignity before the final blow. Anne's queenship had been dismantled not in a single moment, but piece by piece. First the crown removed from her head, then the honors revoked, then the jewels stripped away, until all that remained was a woman in plain garments, her body marked for death, her name sullied beyond recognition. She was no longer Anne the Queen, nor Anne the Reformer, nor Anne the beloved of Henry. She was Anne the condemned, and every detail of her descent was choreographed to ensure that she died not only in body, but in memory. Beyond her chamber, the air of anticipation thickened. London had become a city of whispers, its taverns and markets alive with stories of the Queen's supposed crimes. Some swore she had bewitched the king with spells, others that she had been born with 6 fingers, a witch's mark. They spoke of monstrous births, of unnatural appetites, of nights filled with lovers summoned to her chambers like moths to flame. None of it needed to be true. In fact, the more grotesque the tale, the more eagerly it was repeated, for scandal thrives not on proof, but on imagination. By the time Anne walked to the scaffold, she was not simply a condemned woman, she was a legend of depravity, sculpted by her enemies to terrify those who might dare to follow her path. The men accused with her had already died. One by one, they were dragged to the block, their bodies butchered, their heads mounted as grim trophies upon the tower's gates. Anne heard the cries, the drums, the dull thuds of axes, the sudden silences that followed. She knew each name, each face. Some had been her friends, her allies. One was her own brother. Their blood seeped into the stones before her own feet would touch them. Their deaths were not merely punishments. They were rehearsals for hers, each one reminding her that she was next. It was not enough to kill a queen. She had to be paraded, diminished, made spectacle. On the morning of May 19th, 1536, the ritual began in earnest. The hour was chosen deliberately, early, when the air was damp and heavy, when the city still stirred itself awake, when the spectacle could unfold in solemn stillness. Anne dressed carefully, her gown plain gray, her mantle of scarlet draped across her shoulders. No jewels, no crown, no adornment that might soften the image of a woman abandoned by fortune. She dressed not as a queen, but as a penitent, though whether the choice was hers or her captor's remains forever uncertain. When she emerged, the tower grounds were already filling. Nobles gathered in hushed clusters, their faces schooled into masks of solemnity, but their eyes glinting with curiosity. Commoners pressed as close as they could, eager to fix their gaze upon the queen whose downfall had dominated every corner of gossip. They came not out of love nor pity, but out of the strange hunger that draws human beings to witness the destruction of greatness. It was not enough to hear of it. They needed to see her body humbled, to inhale the final breath of her dignity. Anne's walk across Tower Green was long, though measured in only a few dozen paces. Each step echoed against the silence, her small frame magnified by the immensity of the moment. She carried herself with poise, her head high, her lips moving in whispered prayers. Those who watched could not agree on what they saw. Some swore she looked terrified, her eyes wide and trembling. Others insisted she seemed calm, even serene, as though she had accepted her fate with saintly composure. Perhaps she was both. Perhaps terror and serenity are not opposites, but twin masks worn in the face of inevitable death. Atop the scaffold, the stage was set. The French executioner, summoned at great cost, stood waiting. Unlike the English axemen, who often bungled their work, he was a master of the sword. His blade said to be so sharp, so precise, that a head could fall before its owner even felt the blow. This, too, was part of the theater. Henry had ordered this swordsman not from mercy, but from spectacle. A clean death was not kindness, it was art. The efficiency of the execution would magnify its cruelty, the swift cut contrasting with the long torment that had preceded it. Anne turned to the crowd and spoke, her voice trembling yet audible. She praised Henry as a gracious and merciful king. She declared herself guilty of no crime, yet accepted death as God's will. Every word was scripted, shaped not by her but by the demands of survival. To curse Henry would have been treason, to protest innocence would have been defiance. And so she chose humility, cloaking herself in a language that pleased her enemies even as it erased her truth. The crowd listened, some nodding, some weeping, but all aware that they were witnessing not confession but performance. For in Tudor England, even the condemned were forced to act their part. The ritual stripping of dignity reached its final stage. Anne removed her headdress, tucking her hair beneath the cap, exposing her slender neck. She knelt upright, not on the block but upon the scaffold itself, her posture deliberate, composed. She blindfolded herself, though some claimed she refused, gazing into eternity with unflinching eyes. At her side, the swordsman moved with quiet precision, murmuring words of reassurance in French, distracting her gaze so that she would not see the blade rise. The crowd leaned forward, breath caught in collective anticipation, their silence louder than any roar. It is in this moment, the heartbeat before steel met flesh, that the full weight of her dissent became clear. Anne Boleyn was no longer a woman, no longer a queen, no longer a mother. She was a symbol, stripped of identity, transformed into a lesson for all who might follow. Her innocence had been painted as sin, her ambition as witchcraft, her motherhood as failure. And now, on this scaffold, she was reduced to a body awaiting obliteration, her blood destined to mark the stones as warning. This was not execution. This was ritual. This was humiliation, weaponized, dignity inverted, mercy mocked. This was power announcing itself, declaring before the eyes of London and before the eyes of history that no one, not even a crowned queen, was safe from its blade. And yet, within that ritual humiliation, within that cruel dissent, there flickered something her enemies could not destroy. It was in the poise of her walk, the steadiness of her voice, the quiet dignity of her final prayers. Though they sought to erase her, though they sought to make her a cautionary tale, what endured was not their power, but her composure. In dying as she did, she denied them complete victory. She became not only a victim, but a martyr, her memory destined to haunt the very throne that had condemned her. The swordsman stepped into position. The blade rose, the crowd held its breath, and in that suspended instant before death, history itself seemed to pause. What followed would be swift, merciless, final. But the descent was complete, and the climax was ready to fall. The blade fell in silence. Not the silence of reverence, but the silence of anticipation so taut that it seemed the world itself refused to breathe. A blur of motion, a glint of steel. The French swordsman pivoted with the swiftness of a predator striking prey, and in a single stroke, Anne Boleyn ceased to exist in the realm of the living. Her body crumpled forward, her head tumbled away, her lips, once the instruments of persuasion, once the source of the king's obsession, now frozen, parted in what might have been prayer, might have been shock, might have been nothing at all. The crowd gasped as one, that collective exhalation of awe and terror when violence and finality fuse into spectacle. Some crossed themselves, some whispered that it was merciful, some merely stared, hungry to brand this vision into memory, to carry it as rumor, as story, as proof of their presence at the death of a queen. But the horror did not end with the sword's fall. Her head was not lifted high as a traitor's trophy, not displayed to jeering cries as was common with those accused of treason. Instead, it was placed hastily to one side, almost as if even in death her presence unsettled those who had condemned her. Her body, drained and broken, was not given the dignity of a coffin. No royal bier, no solemn procession. Instead, the remains of Anne Boleyn were stuffed unceremoniously into a rough arrow chest, a container meant not for queens but for weaponry. There, cramped and dishonored, the woman who had once worn the crown of England was carried to her burial in an unmarked grave within the Tower Chapel. A queen erased, reduced to anonymity, denied the rituals of mourning that affirm humanity. Even in death, the machinery of humiliation ground her into silence. The crowd dispersed slowly, whispers lingering in the air like smoke after fire. Some insisted she had died nobly, others murmured that the accusations must have been true, for why else would a king destroy the mother of his child? Fear sharpened these conversations. To defend her openly was dangerous. To question Henry's justice was to invite suspicion upon oneself. And so the city swallowed its unease, repeating the official narrative until repetition hardened into memory. Anne Boleyn had been guilty, Anne Boleyn had been condemned, Anne Boleyn had been erased. That is how tyranny survives, not by silencing every voice, but by teaching those voices to sing the lies willingly. Henry VIII wasted no time. Even as Anne's body cooled within the Tower Chapel, he was already preparing for his next marriage. Jane Seymour, pale, quiet, submissive, stood waiting to take the place Anne had carved at such cost. The king betrothed her within days, married her within weeks, as though the memory of Anne had been not only erased but rewritten. Henry paraded himself as vindicated, cleansed, freed from the curse of a woman who had failed to give him sons. To him, Anne was no longer queen, no longer wife, no longer even mother. She was merely a shadow in his past, a stepping stone toward the son he believed destiny owed him. And yet, the irony of history is merciless. The daughter Anne bore the child Henry dismissed, the girl whose legitimacy he tried to deny, would outlive them all. Elizabeth, that small, unwanted infant, would grow into Elizabeth I, one of the most formidable monarchs in history. The woman Henry had sought to erase became, through her bloodline, immortal. Anne's body may have been broken, her reputation may have been smeared, her name may have been cursed in whispers, but her legacy endured, rising from the ashes of her humiliation to outshine the king who condemned her. Still, the darkness of her death lingers. For Anne's execution was not merely a personal tragedy, nor merely the story of a woman destroyed by ambition. It was a mirror held up to power itself, revealing its truest face. Power does not kill swiftly. Power kills slowly, deliberately, stripping dignity, eroding identity, forcing its victims into performance before delivering the final blow. Power needs spectacle. It needs the crowd. It needs the whispers that confirm its narrative. Anne Boleyn was executed not only to satisfy Henry's desire for freedom, not only to secure his marriage to Jane Seymour, but to send a message: no one, not even a queen, is safe from the machinery of the crown. In the shadows of the tower, that message still echoes. Visitors today stand upon the stones of Tower Green, tracing their fingers over plaques and memorials, imagining the cries of centuries past. Yet behind the tourist rituals lies the darker truth. Those stones once drank her blood, once absorbed the silence of a crowd watching a woman's body destroyed for the crime of being inconvenient. They remind us that history's greatest horrors are often not committed in moments of rage, but in carefully staged performances designed to annihilate not just the person, but the memory of defiance. And so, the shocking truth behind Anne Boleyn's execution is not simply that she was innocent, not simply that she was condemned by lies, not simply that she was denied dignity even in death. The truth is darker. Her execution was ritualized humiliation, a calculated performance of annihilation, staged not only to end her life but to terrify the living into silence. Her death was not an accident of passion, it was a strategy of power, sharpened into steel, choreographed upon the scaffold, and sanctified by the silence of those who watched. When you look back upon that moment, the French sword slicing the morning air, the crowd gasping, the arrow chest sealing away her remains, you are not merely looking at the death of one queen. You are looking at the anatomy of tyranny. You are seeing how power survives, by turning human beings into lessons, by transforming flesh and blood into symbols of submission. Anne Boleyn's story is not simply history, it is a warning. And in that warning lies the final paradox. Though they tried to erase her, though they tried to bury her name in scandal and obscurity, she endures. She endures in the reign of Elizabeth, in the stones of the tower, in the whispers of every visitor who imagines her final walk. She endures because power cannot fully erase dignity, because memory clings stubbornly to those who suffer unjustly. Her enemies sought to silence her forever. Instead, they gave her voice an immortality they could never have foreseen. The executioner's sword ended her life, but it did not end her truth. Her death was darker than we imagine, not because of the blood spilled in an instant, but because of the ritual of humiliation, the annihilation of identity, the spectacle of cruelty that surrounded it. That is the truth that lingers. That is the truth history cannot cleanse. That is the truth that forces us, even now, to remember Anne Boleyn not as they wanted her remembered, but as she was, a woman destroyed by power, yet paradoxically made eternal by it.